At dawn on October 25, 1944, an American destroyer turned away from safety and drove straight at the largest battleship ever built. 20 minutes earlier, a pilot on a routine patrol had radioed something nobody on the American side believed. He reported battleships. Then pagoda masts, the tiered Japanese superstructures that no American ship had, coming over the northern horizon. On the flag bridge of a small escort carrier, a rear admiral told him he was looking at friendly ships. The pilot answered that he had just been shot at by them. Then the horizon began to flash, and the shell splashes came in dyed red and yellow and green. The Japanese colored their salvos to spot the fall of shot. 6 slow escort carriers and 7 small escorts had just been found by the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever put to sea. And behind them, close enough to see, lay the entire American invasion of the Philippines, 250,000 men on the beaches, and the transports feeding them. There was nothing else between the two. No battleships, no fleet carriers, no help within 100 miles, because the admiral who was supposed to be guarding that door had taken his fleet north, chasing something else. What the men of Taffy 3 did in the next 3 hours is still argued about at the Naval War College, and it ended with the Japanese commander doing something no one has ever fully explained. To understand how 13 small ships ended up alone against a battle fleet, start 5 days earlier, on a beach. General Douglas MacArthur had waited ashore at Leyte, keeping the most famous promise of the Pacific War, "I shall return." 200,000 American troops were going onto those beaches, fed by a huge, vulnerable fleet of transports. The entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed with one purpose: get battleships in among those transports, and massacre the invasion at the waterline. Look at the map. The American beachhead sits inside Leyte Gulf. To reach it, a fleet from the north must thread San Bernardino Strait, swing down the coast of Samar, and fall on the Gulf from above. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo, sent 3 forces at once, one to die loudly in the south, one straight through that northern strait, and one, made of aircraft carriers with almost no aircraft left, whose only job was to be seen, far to the north, as bait. The bait was for one man. Admiral William Halsey, Bull Halsey, commanded the Third Fleet, the fast carriers and modern battleships shielding the invasion. On October 24 his pilots caught the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea, hammered it all day, sank the super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister, and watched the survivors turn away west. Halsey concluded the force was crippled, beaten, finished. That night, it turned around again. Because that evening, Halsey took the bait. When the decoy carriers were spotted to the north, he went after them with everything: the fast carriers, the new battleships, every heavy gun that could have barred the door. No plain language warning reached the escort carriers off Samar. San Bernardino Strait, the back door to the beachhead, stood open and unwatched in the dark. And through it, at 20 knots, came Admiral Takeo Kurita. Leading his column was Yamato, 70,000 tons, the largest battleship ever built, with 18.1-inch guns, the biggest naval artillery ever mounted on a ship. One of her broadsides weighed more than everything Taffy 3 could throw in reply, combined. Behind her steamed 3 more battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a screen of light cruisers and destroyers. The force had been hurt. What remained could still annihilate anything it caught. At dawn on October 25, what it caught was Taffy 3. And what it caught was, by any measure, the wrong target. Taffy 3 was 6 escort carriers, slow, thin-skinned flat-tops built on merchant hulls, which the fleet called jeep carriers or, less kindly, combustible, vulnerable and expendable. Screening them were 7 small escorts, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, ships the Navy called tin cans. Their job that morning was ground support for the troops ashore and submarine patrol. Nothing in the formation had been designed to fight a battleship, or expected to. The man about to fight the most desperate surface action in American naval history commanded it from a converted merchant hull. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Ziggy, to the fleet, a Pearl Harbor veteran with a reputation for cool competence and no patience for glory. His 6 escort carriers could make 18 knots on a good day, slower than every warship hunting them. He expected a quiet morning of beach strikes and submarine patrols. Within 3 hours, he would write one of the great pages of the Navy. Understand what a destroyer was in that ocean. 2,100 tons, 1/33 of Yamato. 5-inch guns that could not pierce battleship armor at any range. 10 torpedoes, the only weapons aboard that truly mattered. And no armor at all. Sailors joked you could open a tin can's hull with a church key. By every column of naval arithmetic, Johnston and her sisters were irrelevant to what was coming. Naval arithmetic was about to have a very bad morning. And on the destroyer Johnston, a commander named Ernest Evans, Cherokee and Creek by blood, Oklahoma-born, Annapolis by sheer will. At Johnston's commissioning a year earlier, he had made his crew a promise that now reads like prophecy: "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who does not want to go along had better get off right now." Not one man got off. 327 of them sailed with him to Samar. At 6:37, a pilot on routine anti-submarine patrol broke onto the radio net with a report nobody believed: enemy battleships, cruisers and destroyers, 20 miles northwest of Taffy 3 and closing fast. Sprague's first reaction was that the young man was looking at Halsey's battleships. Then his own lookouts saw them, pagoda masts, tiered like temples, prickling up all along the northern horizon. Then the horizon began to flash. At 6:59, Yamato opened fire, the first and only time her main guns ever spoke to enemy ships. Moments later, geysers taller than the carriers themselves began walking across the formation, red, yellow, green. The Japanese dyed their shell splashes to spot their fall. Survivors described it as beautiful and obscene at once. Sprague did everything right in the same minute, turned east into the wind, launched every aircraft that could fly, worked toward a rain squall, and ordered his little screen to make smoke. This photograph was taken in those minutes, from one of the carriers. The white ribbons are chemical smoke poured out by the destroyers and destroyer escorts, the black is funnel smoke. Under it all, 6 slow flat tops are running for their lives. Sprague's stated plan was simple: delay the enemy until help arrives. Privately, he later admitted, he did not expect to survive the hour. And then, without waiting for any order, one destroyer hauled out of the smoke line and turned north, alone. Ernest Evans had heard the reports and needed nothing more. Survivors remembered his voice on the loudspeaker, calm and flat: "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. We are being pursued by the enemy's fastest and most powerful ships. We will do what damage we can." Then he rang up flank speed and drove USS Johnston, one unarmored destroyer, straight at the massed gunfire of 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. Naval doctrine has a name for it: unsupported torpedo attack. Every language on Earth translates it the same way. Weaving through the colored geysers, Johnston fired more than 200 5-inch rounds on the way in, closed inside 10,000 yards, and emptied all 10 torpedo tubes at the leading heavy cruisers. At about 7:27, the bow of the heavy cruiser Kumano simply ceased to exist, blown off to the forward turret. A 2,000-ton tin can had just knocked a 10,000-ton cruiser out of the war. Minutes later, the reply arrived: 3 battleship shells, then 3 more. Her gunnery officer said it felt like a puppy being smacked by a truck. The hits cut steam lines, silenced half the guns, and swept the bridge with splinters that took most of Evans's shirt and 2 fingers of his left hand. He waved off treatment, moved his con aft, and kept fighting. Then the sea itself took a side, a rain squall swallowed Johnston for 10 precious minutes. When she came out the other side, patched and smoking, listing and half-blind, she attacked again. There was a battleship in her way. She engaged it. Then Sprague released the rest of the leash. Over the radio went one of the shortest orders of the war: small boys, attack. The remaining screen turned north together, the destroyers Hull and Heermann, and behind them a destroyer escort named Samuel B. Roberts, half a destroyer size, 2 5-inch guns, 3 torpedoes. Her captain, Robert Copeland, told his crew over the loudspeaker exactly what they were sailing into: a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival could not be expected. They went anyway. All of them went. Samuel B. Roberts was barely 6 months old, named for a coxswain who died covering the retreat of Marines at Guadalcanal, her crew mostly teenagers on their first deployment. Her chief engineer tied down the boiler safety valves and pushed the little ship past every design limit to keep up with the destroyers. She held her 3 torpedoes through 10,000 yards of falling shells, launched at the cruiser line at point-blank range, and then stayed, gun-dueling armored cruisers muzzle to muzzle. The fleet would remember her by a title, not a number: the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Overhead, everything with wings joined the charge. The air groups of all 3 Taffy units, more than 400 sorties before noon, fell on the Japanese columns with whatever they had: bombs, torpedoes, rockets, depth charges meant for submarines skipped off battleship bows. And when the ordnance ran out, they kept diving anyway: dry runs, empty guns, pilots buzzing bridges to make admirals flinch. None of it could sink the giants. All of it, minute by minute, scattered their formation and stole their nerve. Because on the Japanese flag bridge, the battle had stopped making sense. Kurita's formation had dissolved into a melee in the smoke and squalls. His lookouts, watching small ships charge battleships and refuse to die, reported American fleet carriers, cruisers, full-size destroyers. The tin can's ferocity had become a lie the enemy told himself: no force this small could possibly fight this hard. Somewhere in the smoke, Kurita began to believe he had blundered into Halsey's main fleet, the very fleet that was, at that moment, 300 miles away, chasing empty carriers. But courage does not stop shells. At the rear of the American line, the heavy cruisers found the carrier Gambier Bay. For half an hour they walked their salvos into her thin merchant hull while she made 18 knots and fired back with her single 5-inch gun. A shell in the forward engine room finished it. She slowed, listed, and fell out of the formation the way a wounded animal falls out of a herd. This photograph was taken from USS White Plains, Gambier Bay, bracketed, the near-miss splashes rising higher than her flight deck. At 9:11 she capsized and went under, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire, in any war. 147 of her men died. Around her, the escorts that had shielded her were dying too. Hull, hammered by more than 40 shells, sank at 8:55, 253 of her 340 men were lost. Her survivors, in the water, watched the enemy fleet steam past close enough to see faces. And then, at 9:20, at the very peak of his victory, with the American formation broken and the Gulf almost in sight, signal flags climbed Yamato's halyards: all ships, my course north, speed 20. Kurita was breaking off. Historians still argue the weight of reasons: exhaustion after 4 days under attack, fear of massed airstrikes from carriers he believed were fleet carriers, reports of phantom task forces, a formation he could no longer control. What no one disputes is the arithmetic: the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent to sea was turned around by 13 ships it outweighed 30-1. The turn came too late for the small boys. Samuel B. Roberts, cornered by cruisers, fought until a 14-inch salvo tore a hole the length of a bus in her port side. Gun mount 52 kept firing to the end, no power, no compressed air to clear the breach, the crew hand-loading and firing on raw nerve until a shell cooked off in the hot barrel. Rescuers found the gun captain, 20-year-old Paul Carr, dying in the wreckage of his mount, still cradling the last shell, still trying to load it. The Roberts went down with 90 of her men. Johnston was last. Steering by hand, firing by hand, she had put herself between the enemy and the carriers one final time, charging a destroyer squadron to break up its torpedo run. Surrounded, she was shot to pieces from all sides. Evans, wounded again, gave his last order at 9:45, abandon ship. She sank at 10:10. Men in the water swore that as a Japanese destroyer slid past, her captain stood at the rail and saluted the ship that had fought his whole fleet. Ernest Evans was seen in the water after the sinking. He was never seen again. 300 miles north, the other half of the tragedy played out in a radio room. Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor sent Halsey a 3-word question about his missing battleships, where is Task Force 34, and a clerk's routine security padding turned it into an apparent taunt, the world wonders. Halsey later wrote that he threw his cap to the deck. The battleships turned south at flank speed, and arrived at San Bernardino Strait hours after it mattered. The door they should have guarded had been held shut, all morning, by tin cans. Taffy 3's morning had one more first in it. At 10:51, with the fleet action over, aircraft dove out of the clouds, not to bomb, but to crash. A Zero flown by Lieutenant Yukio Seki plunged into the flight deck of the carrier St. Lo and detonated her own bomb and torpedo stores. She sank in half an hour, 113 of her men died. It was the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. The age of the suicide plane opened on the same morning as the tin can's last stand. History rarely stacks its hinges so high on a single day. The butcher's bill: 5 ships sunk, 2 carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, 23 aircraft, and more than 1,100 Americans killed or missing. And then the sea added interest. Through a chain of command confusion, the survivors, over 1,000 men on rafts, nets and debris, were simply not looked for. They drifted for the better part of 2 days, wounds, thirst, sun, and the sharks that found the rafts on the second night. Some men lived through Yamato's guns and died waiting for a boat. When the rescue ships finally came, the men they pulled aboard had already entered legend. Sprague's official report credited his survival to 2 things: the bull-headed courage of his screen, and, in his words, the definite partiality of Almighty God. Halsey defended his run north for the rest of his life. Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor, posthumously, the only destroyer captain of the Second World War so honored. And the American fleet quietly adopted a name for what happened off Samar, the last stand of the tin can sailors. For 76 years, the ships of Taffy 3 lay where they fell, deeper than any wrecks on Earth. Then, in March 2021, a titanium submersible fell for 4 hours through black water and its lights found steel, USS Johnston, upright on the seabed at 6,456 meters, at the time, the deepest shipwreck ever reached. This photograph, taken through the viewport by explorer Victor Vescovo, shows one of her 5-inch gun mounts. Her hull number, 557, is still readable on the bow. Her guns are still trained outboard, toward where the enemy was. The expedition that found her was privately funded, and it went back. Working from wartime action reports, sonar sweeps of the seabed, and the last known positions logged by ships that were themselves sinking, the team narrowed a search box on the floor of the Philippine Trench, water so deep that the pressure at the bottom is over 1,000 atmospheres, and a submersible has to be built like a spacecraft to go there and come back. A year later, in June 2022, the same expedition found what it called the deepest shipwreck ever identified, Samuel B. Roberts, 6,895 meters down, her bow crumpled by the fall, her torpedo tubes empty, because she had fired everything she had. The smallest ships of the battle now hold the deepest graves of any warships on Earth, 2.5 miles deeper than Titanic. No flag flies that deep. The steel remembers anyway. The Navy has kept faith in its own way. There has been a ship named Samuel B. Roberts in the fleet for most of the years since 1944. A frigate carried the name of Paul Carr, the gun captain who died loading his last shell, and a new destroyer now carries the name Ernest E. Evans. At Annapolis, Samar is taught not as tactics, the tactics were hopeless, but as the Navy's clearest answer to its oldest question, what do we expect of a captain when the odds are absurd? The answer has a whole number. So here is the question Samar leaves behind. Ernest Evans had no orders to attack. The smoke was thick, the squalls were close, no court in the Navy would have blamed a tin can for hiding from Yamato. Instead he turned his ship, and 327 lives, into the guns of the largest battleship ever built. Because he did, and because 12 other crews did the same, the carriers lived, the beachhead lived, and 250,000 soldiers never learned how close it came. Would you have turned the ship? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.